Hello everybody and welcome to part 25 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review Series. Today, after what kind of felt like a season finale of the series with Vindication, we are starting afresh with Volume 7 of the series, which includes 6 issues that cover a couple of short arcs as well as a standalone issue. Although the journey of Zane and the gang feels like it's hit a kind of a soft reset, and some really big questions that have been asked throughout the series that we really haven't gotten any solid answers to yet. What Jarael's true secrets are, what's up with Roland, and how the Mandalorian wars end are all things that I hope that we are going to get to by the end of this series, so let's go ahead and dive straight into it. We begin our first arc, Profit Motive, with issue 36, with a view of an extravagant auction for a gas giant in the Anoat sector rich in Tabana gas and ripe for mining. The trade is taking place on Matelos 3, an airless moon once thought useless until it was found that its unique telescoping facilities allowed for the viewing of undiscovered and valuable astronomical bodies on the edge of known space. Now, the once barren moon attracts many an ambitious financier as the intersection of scientific discovery and commerce. The moon is also visited by academics, such as one professor of law, Griffomarn, who is given a tour by an administrator named Sipiter. The tour is cut short, though, when an enormous Calypsan mining ship enters the moon's airspace, and along with it Captain Brackle and her intimidating masked companion, who claim to arrive on behalf of the world of Italbos, which was just sold off by Matelos 3 before they checked if anybody lived there first. Professor Griffomarn spontaneously decides to represent the young lady and her friend, and suggests a new auction take place on behalf of the Italbosi natives, an auction that may prove to be quite lucrative for them. With the situation out of his control, Sipiter reports back to his Shevan master. Sipiter is a Shev, a species who is traditionally tied to a slave-master relationship with the Chevan species. Nunk Plarvin laments his servant's incompetence and is able to see through the charade of Professor Griffomarn, otherwise known as Marn Hieroglyph. Griff, Jarael, and Roland, still disguised, meet in secret to further discuss their scheme to pull a huge scam on Matelos 3. Though the absence of Zane is felt throughout the crew. He's been gone for a month visiting his family. Suddenly, a team of enforcers wielding energy bolas arrives to capture the crew. Just as one armored soldier is about to send Griff careening into the vacuum of space, Zane arrives for backup, declaring that his little vacation is now over. Moving on to issue 37, Nunk and his servants have captured Jarael and Roland, while Zane and Griff observe them from the rafters. They escape to Griff's enormous new mining ship, the Hot Prospect, which Slisk had stolen on Coruscant to replace the Last Resort. Old habits die hard, I guess. Zane, though, begins to question the morality of Griff's scheme, but Griff assures Zane that they're only hitting No Neck because he's a ruthless slaver. Plus, he's backed by the Raft Syndicate, who Slisk can confirm are not exactly upstanding. Jarael and Roland are taken to a dilapidated solar observatory where they are tied and strung up to be vaporized by the heat of Matelos 3's sun come daybreak. Jarael bemoans her lack of force sensitivity, as at this point, that seems to be the only thing that could possibly get them out of this mess. Roland, though, suggests that the force isn't exclusively owned by the Jedi. As the sun's light breaks through the edge of the observatory's lens and their situation becomes dire, Roland urges Jarael to concentrate, to become what she was truly meant to be. No Neck and his servants elsewhere discuss how they can still stand a profit off of the botched Italbos deal in order to make their next payment to the Raft Syndicate when Zane and Griff arrive guns blazing to rescue their friends. Through some clever costuming, they convince No Neck that they are actually Syndicate enforcers, with Slisk as their pimped out Trandoshan boss, who suggests that their little scheme has proven how inept No Neck and his team truly are at running the place. Griff and Slisk demand that No Neck go see the rafts on Jebel alone, and the Shevan complies, leaving his Shev servants in charge of Matelos 3, who are more likely to be able to run the facility a bit more smoothly and ethically. Sipiter, now free, only regrets that they were too late to save the prisoners, but Jarael arrives to greet them, unharmed, if a little crispy. Roland is also saved and implores Zane to train Jarael in the ways of the Force, offering the broken chain as supposed proof of her newfound abilities. Moving on to the standalone issue 38, the crew debates what they should do with LB, the loader droid once owned by the Jedi Order that's now all but useless now that it believes its old master, Lucian, to be dead. They cut their debate short, though, to begin their next job, investigating a derelict space yacht which had mysteriously gone missing in the well-charted space lanes of the core worlds. They find inside the ship many floating bodies who appear to have been asphyxiated even though the air in the ship seems fine. While investigating, Zane is ambushed by a droid, and when Roland comes to the rescue, a small furry member of the BIM species named Toki Talavar emerges. claiming that the droid, KO, is only there to protect him. As the crew restores light and gravity to the ship, Toki explains that after some business on Corellia, the other passengers on the ship suddenly started showing up dead, and that he doesn't know much more than Zane and the others about what happened. Zane also soon discovers that LB has become quite active again and is helping remove bodies after talking to KO, who happens to be from the same manufacturing plant on Rendili. Roland, after inspecting the bodies, realizes that they all died by strangulation, and at that moment, Zane gets a call that something is wrong with Slisk in the galley. Arriving to find Slisk unable to breathe, so Roland, using his knowledge of battlefield medicine, punctures Slisk's windpipe just right to allow air to pass into his lungs. Suspecting KO must be behind the strangulations, Zane finds the droid and slices off his arms, but his new friend LB retaliates, attacking Zane and Roland. KO tries to explain that he's only programmed to help people, not hurt them, and elaborates on a long string of mysterious strangulations that have occurred around his master Toki throughout the years, and how KO always helped him by hiding the bodies. KO always asserted that his master was innocent, as someone so small couldn't possibly strangle so many, but Zane knows of all people that, for some, size matters not. Back in the galley, Toki force chokes Jarail, revealing that he was once a secret Sith assassin during the Sith Wars. He may not be able to help the Sith rise again,
the Force shall rise again,
but he takes great joy in killing other beings who might misjudge him for his size. Zane arrives and shoots Toki, but it's not enough to take down the little Darksider, and he lunges at Zane with a red lightsaber. Cornering Zane after a brief duel, KO is still determined to fulfill his duty to protect his master, by protecting him from himself. As the droid restrains his master and electrocutes him, Toki raves that he will finish what he started by destroying Zane and Jarail. Roland believes him and destroys both droid and master. Though Zane is dismayed by all the killing, Roland pushes him aside, asserting that if Zane cannot protect Jarail, then he's no good to him. Later, Zane finds LB and vents to the droid about Slisk, who's now more timid than ever. Roland, who seems much colder than when they first met on Flashpoint and now is strangely obsessed with Jarail, and Jarail herself, whose sudden Force talent confuses Zane. He also wonders when Griff will ask him what he was doing on his vacation, and is certain that he won't like it. Zane is happy though to be able to talk to LB, even though he doesn't ever really say anything back. Moving on to issue 39, with the Dueling Ambitions arc, we witness a ferocious battle between a Gotal on a swoop bike and a Togorian on a monstrous flying mount. The fight is actually a gladiator match, and the Gotal, who is the long victorious fighter Gothar Klege, has won his 4th solo aerial duel in a row. As Klege gives a victory speech announcing his retirement, we get some exposition about the state of dueling as a legitimate sport in the Republic, and how it's become popularized under management by a main franchise operated by the Krish species. In this system, fighters can earn sponsorships and become beloved superstars. Jarail accompanies a wide-eyed Zane to Jervo's world, the space station that holds the games. Zane's been obsessed with swoop racing since his childhood on Terrace, and curses his luck that he missed Gothar Klege's last ride by just a few hours. Fortunately though, the two are just in time for a qualifying match. They happen to find Griff, or excuse me, Bull Griff Mandrake in the stands, already cooking up a scheme to rip off the franchise through their gambling circuit. Zane, however, sees a chance to enter the games as an amateur to win a swoop bike painted in Gothar's signature racing colors. As he runs off, Jarail notes that this is the second worst date that she's ever had. We next see Gothar tied up and beaten by the Krish and their leader, Bardran, where we see that Gothar in his retirement speech was actually trying to expose the lower levels of the franchise's fighting system, which is actually run as a brutal farm built to churn out the best warriors, who are essentially slaves. When Bardran threatens to send him back to the farms, he defiantly agrees, believing that his son is still stuck in the slave pits. Bardran, though, shows Gothar that his son Albin is actually there with them, held at the station, being placed in rigged fights to make it to the open match, as the viewers expect one Klege or another to emerge victorious. Bardran's proposal is this: he'll put Gothar in the open, and if both of them win, they can retire for real, but if they lose, they'll stay in the system with no hope of escape. As Zane wows the audience with his unexpected swoop bike prowess and tear-jerking backstory, Jarail ignores Griff's pleas to place bets on the matches, as she can't stomach participating in a system that profits off such violence, even though Griff points out that legal barriers ensure that nobody dies in the matches. usually. Jor-El's willing to stick it out for a bit longer though, as the 19-year-old Zane has been through a lot and is the only person who hasn't been pushing her to her limits lately. Suddenly, Roland, who tagged along with them, is attacked by security guards who are understandably alarmed by the presence of a Mandalorian, but Griff vouches for him, who says he's a novelty act for an upcoming match, and Roland begrudgingly accepts modifications to his armor to bring him up to regulation. In the locker room, Zane finds Gothar's cowering son, and soon Gothar himself, who explains that his son is struggling with madness. The cones on the heads of Gotals receive electromagnetic signals from everyone and everything, and Albin wasn't raised to filter them out properly. Though Zane is beyond excited to meet his childhood hero, Gothar demands that he keeps his son alive until the finals, or he'll kill him and everyone he loves. Speeding on to issue 40, Zane struggles to keep Albin alive in the fast-paced semifinals. After narrowly avoiding a deadly explosion, the two land unscathed and advance to the tandem finals, though some are already calling Albin Gothar's shame, while Zane tries to remind himself that he's here to have fun. Meanwhile, in the other semifinals, Roland, now dubbed Spikes, battles with Gothar himself. The two eventually team up to defeat the remaining warriors though, and advance to the finals as the last two standing. Though Roland boasts that he is fighting down to a science, he asserts that Gothar fights as if he's fighting for someone, and Gothar thinks that Roland is too. Elsewhere, Jor-El has a dream, where she dives into the Jedi Temple on Terrace to be confronted by the specters of Malak, Roland, Demigul, and Adaska, who implore her to become what she is truly meant to be. They urge her to reveal who she was before she met Camper, a past that would supposedly reveal the origins of her abilities. After seeing Zane captured by a mysterious figure, she wakes up on the hot prospect to find the real Zane venting his frustrations once again to LB. Jor-El gives Zane a recording of Gothar's retirement speech that Griff managed to snag, and it shows what Gothar really said, a tirade about the brutality of the fighting in the industry's lower levels. Zane is horrified at learning the truth and confronts Gothar, who elaborates that he doesn't have the freedom to leave when he wants, despite being a famous superstar who people make toys out of. Gothar had hoped his son would never have to fight professionally, but admits that it's better than being in the slave pits with their mysterious gang leader. Gothar also reveals that his horns are prosthetic, his real ones removed long ago by the slave master, a heinous act that left him unable to help his son with his own. Zane tries to help Albin with some Jedi insight, but Gothar doesn't think that he can help, and also doesn't believe the deal that Bargeron made with him, but decides to cling to false hope anyway, rather than have none. Gothar praises Zane and Roland's fighting ability and urges them to try and win. Elsewhere on the station, Jervo of Lozan Industries, who's the owner and namesake of the station, is enraged that his old enemy Zane, and likely Griff too, are on the station, and orders them found before Griff tries to con the station guards out of their pants or something. Jervo also doesn't want the dark secret of how the industry works from getting out, and Bargeron plans for a tragic accident to take care of Gothar once and for all. Little do they know, though, that a certain sneaky Snivian is hiding right under their noses, recording every single thing that they're saying. Speeding into the 41st and final issue, the station's guards are on high alert for Griff and Jor-El. A disguised Jor-El manages to steal a data cube from a swooning musician, while LB infiltrates the station's droid-controlled cleaning crew. As Jervo and Bargeron review all the ways they've rigged the match, such as live weapons and venom-soaked claws on the opponents, Zane tries to drum up ideas on how to get out of there alive, but Roland assures him that Griff has something planned. As the four challengers fight off other gladiators, Gothar agrees to go along with Zane, crashing a speeder into the arena's glass dome to escape, while Jor-El inserts the data cube to play on the loudspeakers Gothar's true recording, as well as tapes of Jervo's nefarious schemes. As the audience begins to riot in a bid to save face, Bargeron just ignores the chaos and declares Roland the winner, disqualifying all of the others for leaving the arena. At a spaceport on an idyllic ocean world, Roland is now a superstar, and though word hasn't yet gotten out about the true nature of the franchise, Zane is determined to get Gothar to people who will spread his message and get proper help for his son. When Gothar asks Zane about his duelist dreams, he admits that games are fun, but some people are fighting for real things, and it makes more sense to help them first. Zane breaks off to tell Jor-El that he's there if she ever needs consultation on the Force, but suddenly Gothar attacks Jor-El, claiming to recognize what she truly is based on the tattoos on her face. He storms off, claiming that if Zane were really who he said he was, he would be nowhere around her. As Jor-El runs off into the ship, Zane asks her for answers. He asks if the tattoos meant that Jor-El was once a slave, but she admits that long ago, before she found Camper, she was actually a slaver. Elsewhere, Jervo tells Bargeron that he's worked the media in the hopes of still containing the truth about the franchise. He tells Bordrin that after this, he hopes he never sees him again, and a mysterious woman whispers that he never will, and strangles him to death. The woman, a red-skinned, scantily clad Zeltron named Shantique, asks if she, meaning Jarael, was there, and monologues that she can't hide from her, and that anyone who helps her will pay. Alright, so what we have here is really a pretty decent grab bag of solid Star Wars adventures that I think does a really good job of sort of reinvigorating the series after a lot of things were kind of tied up really nicely in the quasi-finale that we got last volume with Vindication. The first arc, Prophet Motive, is a pretty simple one that gives us a look into a part of the galaxy we haven't seen yet, at least not chronologically, which is kind of the wealthy, pseudo-legitimate sphere of the galaxy that has shady operations going on. I've talked before about how the usual criminal underworld of the galaxy, you know, kind of like the seedy criminal underbelly which is shown in works like the Han Solo movie, that usually isn't the most interesting part of Star Wars to me. I am very much interested in like Jedi and Sith lore, and I have to say that usually this kind of part of the galaxy that is shown here, which is like the rich socialite criminal sphere, is only a marginally more interesting to me in general, though I think there are definitely some very interesting stories and themes to be explored with kind of the evils of space capitalism. Seeing a very diverse array of rich aliens in spacesuits I think is very fun, and as much flack as the casino scene in The Last Jedi gets, I think that was a very fun part of that movie, and I think it's something I wish we saw more often because Star Wars tends to focus very heavily on kind of these grungy, used future settings. In terms of characters, it is really nice to see Griff kind of making an effort for Zane to only scam people that really deserve it, and then watching the crew once again come up with another fun plan to kind of execute their scheme was probably the most fun part of this arc for me, although the usual plot of them just dressing up in disguises is starting to get a little old for me at this point. There's a big part of me that is seriously beginning to wonder where they are finding all of the materials for these costumes and like how much time they have to really plan these schemes. Like putting Jarael in an eye patch and Roland in a new helmet seems pretty plausible to me, but I have no idea how they managed to make a perfect replica of the mirror talisman last time. One thing that I am of course always happy to learn about are new customs and cultures for alien species in the galaxy, with of course one great example being the Fioran from the Exalted arc a couple arcs back. I'm a little bit familiar already with some Shevan characters like Ifant Mon from Return of the Jedi, but this is the first thing I've seen that really dives into like their more general culture of their species, particularly how they have a whole other sentient species as their slaves. Obviously you can't learn everything about a whole species or a whole culture in like one or two issues, but it's fun to learn about them through certain individuals, especially since it seems that most Shevans seem to be pretty scummy like this, and you know, to have this one outsmarted by our heroes and his slaves freed is nice to see. I mean, is it really a Star Wars story if you have your heroes free a slave but absolutely refuse to confront the issue as a systemic thing at all? You know, Star Wars is very much like a pulpy fantasy franchise, so having an ugly alien be a very simple-minded evil antagonist of the week, it feels very natural, but it does kind of get into the territory of like, you know, that old Tolkien-esque moral debate where it's like if you have a fantasy story that has multiple fantasy races and one of them is almost universally evil, but the story overall emphasizes this overall struggle between good and evil, and like the importance of free will, it creates a little bit of a conundrum. And trust me, No-Neck Plarvin is far from the first Shevan to be depicted as mean, stinky, and overall unpleasant. I suppose those moral considerations are usually reserved for the more human or humanoid characters and not the giant blobs of fat, unless stated otherwise. But that's just kind of like a fantasy or pulp fantasy trend that Star Wars usually adheres to. It's not exclusive to Star Wars by any means. It's just something I was thinking about while reading this particular arc, especially because I did just finish Lord of the Rings. You know, I don't think it collapses the story or reflects poorly on the principle of the writers or anything like that. Sometimes you just need your heroes to save some pitiful slaves from a big, gross, hairy, cartoonishly evil guy. But whenever a Star Wars author decides they are going to want to write a novel-length dissertation on the moral considerations of the Shevan race, I'm going to be the first one to read that. To get back on track though, I'm not sure that I have too many other thoughts on the Prophet Motive arc. I do think that this new evolving dynamic with Zane and Griff, where they're kind of treating each other as equals and compromising more between each other on their missions, is a really good development. Seeing Griff give some moral ground to Zane without really sacrificing anything about his core nature as like a lovable con artist is a nice way to, I think, develop his character further. The stuff with Jarael and Roland in the Force is definitely interesting. I feel like they've been giving little hints that Jarael could possibly be force sensitive. And like, while she has been a really good fighter so far, for them to just now acknowledge that she could be force sensitive feels kind of sketchy to me, especially since we as the audience don't get to directly see her break this chain or whatever to get free. I might touch on that a little bit more later, because there are some more details that show up later in this volume that make all of these things more compelling and also a lot more confusing at the same time. I wish we knew more about these guys in helmets. I guess they're just like basic goons for the guys on Matelos 3, but their helmets are just too cool for them to have been used for this one like fight. They also look a lot to me like the Sith Troopers from the Knights of the Old Republic game. I don't know if this was meant as like an intentional connection, but you know, timeline wise that doesn't really make any sense. And finally, we do get Bong Dazo back as the penciler for these two issues. Overall, he does a good job. I think the way he does Griff and all of the new alien characters is really good. There's kind of like this distinct texture and lumpiness he gives certain alien characters. Overall, I think his style is very exaggerated and playful, and I think it works really, really well for something where the emotional stakes are a bit less than something like Vindication. Though having to jump back and forth constantly between so many different styles doesn't really benefit any ongoing comic series, so that is definitely a bit more of a frustration, especially for the more humanoid characters like Zane and Jarael constantly look very different from issue to issue. Not that that's the specific artist's fault at all, and I imagine that just practically it's more often than not you need multiple artists if you're going to keep a series this long going. It can be a little bit disorienting when our main characters look so different all the time. Overall, Prophet Motive is a pretty decent arc that gets our story back on track, planning some new plot threads and mysteries here and there, but in and of itself really wasn't the most interesting we've seen from this series, even though I guess it didn't really have to be. Anyway, I think I'll just give Prophet Motive a 3 out of 5 stinky Shevin crime bosses. So next up, we have our little single issue story titled Faithful Execution, and I have to say that there are a lot of things I really liked here as well. I like how the crew now has a lot more freedom to operate, almost as like independent contractors almost. You know, they can just like hop in and out for a rescue mission with the support of the Republic without having to constantly run from the Republic or any other faction. While Zane's wanted status in some of the earlier stories was definitely a really great way to drum up stakes and action, I definitely think there's a great benefit of allowing the crew a little bit of breathing room and a bit more safety when traveling and getting around to work. It's kind of a little thing, but it's kind of nice to not have every single story sort of begin and end with these implied really high stakes. Overall, this story was a fun little mystery incorporating elements of the Force that I actually really liked. It's really not hard to figure out who did the strangulations before the full reveal, but the idea of an unassuming little alien being this secret Sith warrior or serial killer, using his contempt for people who judge him by his appearance to kind of like enhance in his hatred and his dark side power, is a really fun idea that I think works great here for a small brief story. I myself am only 5'4", so having a story about a physically small Force user, or really any other physically unusual Force user who is also very powerful, whether they're good or bad, those are always really fun stories for me. And even like we've already seen in this series, some Jedi warriors that look really weird or are physically just not the same or don't have the same capabilities of other Jedi in some sense, those are some of my Jedi that end up being my favorite, because I feel like that really encompasses everything we've known about what makes a strong Jedi since The Empire Strikes Back. It doesn't require great physical size or immense physical strength necessarily, it just requires, you know, strength of mind and dedication. Now that I think about it, I don't know if we've gotten that many villains in Star Wars where their character design tends to be cute. I don't have it written down, or I don't know whether or not this species has been featured in anything else, but I think it's fun to see a Sith acolyte of sorts that has this character design of being very cute, because a lot of the times in Star Wars the character designs are very much finely tailored to be very intimidating. I also do want to note real quick that the Corellian Strangler from one of the news organs a few volumes ago, I never expected that to come up again because it was just like a little throwaway thing and some extra flavor text, And yeah, I didn't even make that connection until I was checking Toki's Wikipedia page. So, you know, there's that. I like that John Jackson Miller very much has all of his ducks in a row in terms of the storytelling pieces that he wants to connect together. Another thing about Toki that I find pretty interesting is that, like, every time we get any kind of new expansion on the lore behind the Sith War with Exar Kun, it makes the conflict seem a lot bigger than it was in the Tales of the Jedi comics. The Tales of the Jedi comics are very much like, say, the Skywalker Saga movies, where we're focusing on the characters who are very central to the biggest moving pieces of the war, and I guess it makes sense that we don't really get to see a very rounded view of the war like we're getting here for the first time in Knights of the Old Republic. You know, obviously the Sith War was a very wide-ranging, large-scale conflict. All of that to basically say is, Tothi says that he was a Sith adept in the commerce industry, and I really didn't get the impression from those comics that there was this wide-ranging Sith corruption throughout the Republic, or that there was even enough time for that kind of thing to happen. We see Exar Kun take on a few Jedi students, as best I remember, but beyond that, it's surprising that we continue to get in these comics, and not just these comics, you know, if you remember I think it was Shadows and Light was the name of one of the Tales comics that we covered way earlier. It's just interesting when retroactive lore is added to the series, and it's not that it doesn't fit, it's just surprising that I feel like we got a very comprehensive view of all the important beats of the Sith War, and this retroactive lore is making it seem bigger than it once appeared, and I think that's interesting. It's just a lot of weird stuff was going on during the Sith War, and I guess as part of any war or any story, ramifications of that sometimes only become clear years afterward. There's also something to be examined in this story, I think, about droids and like droid rights and kind of some of the philosophy behind all of that. I think Star Wars is pretty inconsistent on the morality it places on how people decide to treat droids. Usually our favorite droids are considered lovable, sentient characters, just like the people, and the characters that treat them well are considered moral, and the characters who don't are considered rude or evil. But also, if droids end up in the way of the good guys, chopping them down is rarely ever considered a bad thing that should be mulled over for too long, although I guess it also just goes for any, like, faceless enemy, including human stormtroopers. But basically, Zane chops off the arms of Toki's droid KO just for being a suspect in this little mystery, and he doesn't get as much as an apology. And then meanwhile, we have him creating a new relationship with LB and being very fond of him, but at the same time, at the beginning of the issue, they're talking about getting rid of him just because he seems to not be very useful. How droids are handled in Star Wars is a really interesting topic that I don't think I have the time to go into right now. There's a really good video on it I saw once that covers this in a lot more detail and across the saga, so I'll put that like right here, if I end up remembering to do that. I think that's about all I have to say for this issue. I will mention that we have a new penciler here in Dean Zachary. His style here is really pretty distinct from things that we've seen so far in this series, much more obviously sketchy lines and shading. I think that really benefits this kind of dark, shadowy murder story. Toki can be either very cute or very terrifying depending on what part of the story it is and what mood needs to be conveyed, and I think Zane especially looks very rugged here in a way that suits him with the stubble. I think it makes some sense that some depictions of him would skew this way after all he's been through, even if he is just 19. Though this might not be an artist that I would want drawing every issue of the series, I think Zachary's art is excellent here for what the story is. Moving on to the most substantial arc of this volume, Dueling Ambitions, I definitely think that it was the most interesting and entertaining out of the bunch. I think for a comic series or any ongoing series, I think a very good story of the week villain is a corrupt system that needs dismantling. And also having a focus on like this new character that is a reluctant fighter and his son just really gives the story a very well characterized, I guess, human element, for lack of a better word, humanoid element, I guess. There we go. It just feels like this arc really had, even though it uses temporary new characters and temporary villains, it feels like it had a lot of time to flesh out its emotional stakes, more so than maybe some others in this series. I feel like it really used its time effectively, and I really appreciated that, and I feel like the story benefited greatly from just getting to know KOTOR and his struggles. and building him up to be very strong and gruff, but also extremely vulnerable and sympathetic. I just feel like in a short amount of time, he was characterized very well in a way that it felt like we could get to know him and throw him in the action with these characters that we've known for much longer without skipping a beat. Plus, getting some more lore on some alien species is always something that I appreciate, be it societal or psychological, which we get a little bit of both. I'm not sure which piece of media it was to first go into the KOTOR species, their characteristic of the cones on their head that have electromagnetic signals. Although I will say I did just finish the Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina short story collection, and they definitely bring it up there, so to kind of read these two stories at the same time was a really nice little connection. So always something that I love is when some minor element from a film, especially one that fans of the series that grew up with like all of the Kenner action figures would want to put in their own little story. I wonder if I should start doing that. I wonder if when a new species shows up or some other kind of recognizable element from the greater saga shows up in one of these, I should mention their first appearance and when they came from. That's something that I think I'll be able to do now as I'm reading more Star Wars material from this series, other things from Legends, and other things from canon in my own free time. Anyway, going on with the KOTOR species, I always love in Star Wars and other fantasy stories when a unique physiological or cultural trait of a fantasy race or culture are somehow integral to the plot or emotional stakes of a story. After all, I think a huge part of what makes sci-fi and fantasy so interesting is for people to read about things that they couldn't possibly experience or bear witness to in real life. And though Star Wars almost always focuses on human or very near human characters, it's nice to have at least a side character or like a temporary protagonist have this physiological trait that plays an emotional role in the story. Moving on, Zane's personal arc in this story was fairly small and pretty straightforward, but it was a pretty good one. I think him being very distracted and enthralled in this swoop race circuit, which is definitely played off here as like a very childish fixation, and him kind of having to grow out of it, mostly because, and especially because of, learning that it's run by a slave ring. I think it's very natural for his character. I think it does good service to the story for us to really keep in mind just how young Zane is, and he is still going to have some of those traits of being young and having some of those interests. It adds depth to his character. It definitely feels right in place for the story, but he also doesn't hesitate to sacrifice kind of this fantasy he has once he does learn the true nature of his little hobby. But I think what this arc for him really does is that it shows fundamentally what we've known about Zane and what he's demonstrated several times, is that fundamentally he is a selfless person, and he's not going to let some fantasy really get in the way of that, or lets any other kind of ambition get in the way of his fundamental want to help people. In fact, it feels like this is definitely one of the smaller challenges Zane has faced, at least from like a moral standpoint. And really, now that I think about it, I think it's pretty fair to say that Zane has never really faced any significant choices in like what to do. It's always how to get there. I don't think Zane yet has ever encountered anything where he's genuinely not sure like which position is more morally correct and what he should do from a moral standpoint. And I think that would be interesting to see in the future of this series. I will also say that there is some fantastic action in this arc that definitely needs to be addressed. I didn't draw a whole lot of attention to it in the panels I used for the plot summary, because I tend to really try and narrow it down to the specifics of the plot, and I also don't want to get copyright struck or something by using too many visuals from the comics or like too many wide selections of certain pages or panels. But something that always is an essential part of any Star Wars story are the action set pieces, and in mediums that allow it, the visual element to it. Just think about how special the pod racing scene was in 1999, or any really iconic visually stunning shot from any of the movies. That took a lot of ingenuity and artistry to really figure out how all of that was going to work. And while all of that is a lot more simple in terms of comics, some of it in this arc I think is just really fine, really damn good art. In a medium like comics, you don't need to reinvent the wheel or do something completely revolutionary to make a blue alien blow up in a certain way. If you just have a decent artist with a decent premise, you can make a really solid action scene, and I think what we get here is beyond solid. These huge swoop bike battles take place in arenas that have all of these different biomes and environments in them, and it all just is very fun and very exciting when the fighters are all zooming around and the speeders have like these contrails, and there's lasers and lightsabers going everywhere. There's these bright, curving lights and explosions, and I think Brian Ching, who returned to do the art, and the colorist both did fantastic jobs here. In my opinion, Brian Ching's art is, of course, always a welcome addition to this series. He just always continues to give the series a consistent visual style that is also consistently exciting. This particular story is visually bright and chaotic with very dark undertones, and I feel like all the different elements of Brian's style are able to really bring it to life in a way that I was very satisfied with. You know, the KOTOR, the Krish, all of these different characters and parties have all of these very tense relationships, and I think Brian Ching's method of drawing these very grizzled and angry facial expressions just did good work for the characters. I also feel like Ching has a very valuable skill as a comic writer in that he knows when to break up the panels in order to make the action look far more dynamic as if it's moving. And sometimes he also just really simply is able to make use of good negative space in order to convey physical space or loneliness. And so finally, I think it's time to talk about the Arcanian offshoot in the room, Jerael. I'm very happy that she seems to finally be growing into her rightful place as co-lead of the series alongside Zane, especially now that Zane seems to be mostly done with the bulk of his character development. But every question that seems to be answered about Jerael, it seems that we're only getting more questions. For a while now, I've wondered what this mysterious special aspect is about her that made her so important to Adaska, and it might be the same thing that's making her so special to Roland. It probably has something to do with her genetics, based on what Adaska said, and maybe she's some like mysterious force clone and that's where her supposed abilities are coming from. I'm not sure, all of that could be true, but I think the main thing that of course gets brought up here and directly addressed is that Jerael was once a slaver, and that's not really something that we had any kind of hint or indication towards as far as I can remember. Obviously, she's changed a lot since then, and that part of her old life doesn't really seem to color the way that she treats people now. Of course, she's very worried about herself or Camper, but she's never been outwardly malicious towards anybody the way that you think a slaver character might. So I guess in that regards, I'm not quite sure what to think of her yet, because all we know is that she was closely associated with a certain category of people, but she hasn't really been given a chance to explain or defend herself. Something tells me that this is kind of rooted in being a misunderstanding. I feel like we've very much been told and shown just how Jerael is, and I feel like her being a slaver isn't the end-all be-all. She is clearly ashamed of it, at least, so at least if she was once a bad person, she has kind of moved on from that. I don't know, maybe it would be more interesting if she was like secretly a really shitty person, but I really don't think we've gotten any of that here. Like I said, she used to be very self-interested with only her and Camper, but I think that's a pretty normal arc for a lot of Star Wars characters to go through. It's like they meet a Jedi and they end up going on missions and they end up becoming a part of something bigger than themselves. I really don't know how all of this ties into her being force sensitive, potentially. The story is absolutely not being very clear on the specifics of her potential in that regard, and that makes me think that that could also just be a huge red herring too, since we've never seen her directly use any force abilities. We've just seen her be pretty good at armed combat. Although the very dramatic dream that she has in this volume definitely lends towards things that we know about Force visions, or looks like Force visions we've seen throughout the saga, but I think a bizarre dream about your anxieties is definitely not exclusive to Force-sensitive people. I don't know, the story has not yet consolidated all of its indicators on what it's trying to tell us or hint at us is going on. Like I said, every question about Jerael just leads to more questions, and I'm not even gonna speculate on it too much because I hope that we are going to get conclusive answers to all of this soon enough. Same goes for Roland too. I've spent way too long questioning and wondering what's going on with him. It feels like since Flashpoint we haven't gotten anything interesting character-wise from him, and also his obsession with Jerael seems to now define his character, and it feels like we are on the verge of finally getting some kind of answer to that too. I hope. So yeah, I'm just gonna end it there. I think that Dueling Ambitions gets a nice tasty 4.5 out of 5 KOTOR Gladiators. Next time we are going to be covering Volume 8 of this series, which is titled Destroyer, and also covers a couple of short story arcs. We're getting closer and closer to the end here, so let's hope that, force be willing, the mysteries of Jerael and Roland will soon be solved. I hope you guys are looking forward to that, and until next time, may the Force be with you, always.